Get down, Calder! Colonel Bragg's shout cracked across the command post, a heartbeat before the roof tore apart in a roar of collapsing girders. Nash Calder threw himself sideways as the reinforced ceiling buckled, shards of stonecrete and iron beams raining onto the map tables. Sparks spat across the floor as power lines ripped free, the taste of burnt wiring biting into his throat. He landed hard, cheek pressed against grit, and blinked through stinging eyes at the chaos unfolding around him. Alarms bellowed, not the calm warnings of drills but the ragged shrieks of machinery pushed beyond endurance. Men scrambled between fallen beams, dragging comrades from under wreckage, coughing as smoke turned the air into something that scalded lungs. Calder forced himself up on trembling arms and stumbled toward Bragg. The colonel was pinned under a slab of debris, his uniform torn open and blood spreading in a steady dark bloom. Bragg's breath rattled, but his eyes still carried command. He caught Calder's sleeve with surprising strength. "You'll hold through put," Bragg rasped, teeth stained crimson. "Convoys must flow, or the fleet dies in orbit." His hand fell away, fingers twitching once before going still. Calder felt a hollow silence surge inside him, louder than the alarms. The man who had held this regiment together was gone in an instant, crushed like the walls around them. For a moment, Calder wanted to freeze, to cling to the shock. But training slammed through the fog. Someone had to lead. "Red! Ivers! Vance!" His voice cracked as he shouted across the ruins. Faces turned through dust, grim and waiting. Merrick Ivers, the veteran sergeant major, clambered over a shattered console, one side of his face streaked with soot. Tomas Red, the engineering officer, hauled himself upright from under tangled wiring, limping but alive. Jory Vance, commander of the drone teams, staggered in with one shoulder blackened from a burst capacitor. All three men locked eyes with Calder. The weight in their stares told him what he already knew. Command was his. "Colonel Bragg is dead," Calder said, the words cutting his throat raw. "The Directorate thinks they've crippled us with one strike. They're wrong. We'll keep Halcyon 9 alive. We'll hold every line until the convoys can dock again." Outside, the world shuddered. The Kryphos Directorate's first salvo had torn through orbital defense nodes, cracked supply depots, and gutted the regiment's command post. Through the shattered ceiling, Calder glimpsed the sky lit by falling streaks of fire. Interdiction nets glittered as they snapped shut around the planet, strangling communication and transit. A heavy concussive wave rolled across the city as another strike leveled the freight yards. The ground quaked, rattling teeth in their jaws. Ivers spat into the dust and barked, "Orders, Captain!" The title felt too heavy, but Calder squared his shoulders. "We stabilize survivors first, then we build. Every minute we hold this city keeps the supply lanes breathing." They moved. Men scrambled into order, medics crawling across rubble to reach the wounded. Red directed teams to salvage comm relays from shattered panels, his hands bleeding as he pulled out intact cores. Vance swore under his breath while rebooting drone uplinks, his console smeared with ash. Calder stalked among them, his boots crunching across glass and stone, offering clipped orders, gripping arms, forcing men upright when despair threatened to drag them down. An hour later, they had reestablished a field command inside a half-collapsed depot. The roof groaned above them, but held. Makeshift tables bore scattered charts, their edges curling from heat. A single laser display flickered, fed by salvaged batteries, sketching the city grid in angry red lines where bombardments had already fallen. Calder leaned over the map as the others gathered. "The Directorate doesn't want annihilation," Calder said, voice steady though his throat ached. "They want this city intact. They need these docks, these refineries. That's why they're not burning everything from orbit." "Doesn't mean they won't," Red muttered, rubbing grime from his glasses. "If they decide the infrastructure's not worth the fight, then we make it worth the fight," Calder cut him off. "We give them resistance strong enough to draw them into ground operations. They'll try to strangle us with walkers, drones, and standoff bombardments. But they won't risk close quarters fighting because they know what happens when they step into our streets." Vance snorted, his voice hoarse. "So you're saying we bait them in, bleed them block by block?" Calder met his eyes. "I'm saying we build a city they can't read. We turn every fiber line, every container stack, every mag rail into a weapon. They think regular infantry are easy meat. We'll teach them otherwise. The words hung in the air, charged not with bravado, but with grim weight. Men nodded, jaws clenched, eyes burning through exhaustion. Bragg's body still lay under the wreckage, but his final order lived on in Calder's throat. Moments later, the command post shook again. A low thunder grew outside, deeper and closer. The directorate had committed their first Walker patrols to sweep the districts. The ground reverberated with each metallic step, windows shattering under the shock waves. From the street came screams and the sharp crack of energy weapons. Civilians ran, clutching children in packs, their faces pale masks streaked with soot. Calder grabbed his rifle, the familiar weight anchoring him. Ivers, rally second platoon. Hold the freight boulevard. Vance, get eyes in the air now. I want every drone flying, even if it barely hovers. Red, rig those storm drains with your best surprises. If the walkers want this city, they'll choke on it. Ivers clapped his captain on the shoulder. Aye, sir. Let's show them what regulars look like. They split into action. Calder stormed into the street with his platoon, the smell of dust and scorched masonry choking every breath. Firelight flickered off broken glass and twisted steel. The first walker loomed at the boulevard's edge, legs pounding craters into asphalt, cannon swiveling. Its searchlights cut through smoke, pinning fleeing civilians in blinding glare. A child screamed, covering his ears as the ground shook. Shields up! Calder roared. Men dragged barriers across the street. Wrecked transports flipped into makeshift walls, shielding the evacuation route. Rifle fire cracked, bouncing off the walkers' armored plates. Sparks cascaded, useless against the towering machine. But as the walker advanced, Red's handiwork sprang to life. A drain cover flipped open, and a torrent of shaped charges detonated under its leading leg. Metal shrieked as the limb buckled, the giant collapsing sideways into the ruins of a hab block. The ground shuddered like an earthquake, glass exploding from windows, smoke rolling in waves. Cheers erupted, brief and raw. Calder didn't let them last. Stay sharp! That was the scout. More will follow. He scanned the skyline. Distant flashes lit the horizon as enemy fire pounded other districts. Vance's drones buzzed overhead, battered and sputtering, but feeding back images of the enemy forming staging lines outside the city. The assault was only beginning. Calder tightened his grip on his rifle, the weapon warm against his palm. In that moment, amid the screams, the fires, and the collapsing buildings, he felt the weight settle fully on his shoulders. Colonel Bragg had trusted him with throughput, with the survival of an entire colony and the supply lines beyond. He could not let them fail. He would not. Hold this ground, he said, voice carrying across the boulevard. Every crate, every streetlight, every slab of stone, they're all weapons in our hands. The Directorate wants Halcyon 9 alive? Then they'll have to bleed for it. The men answered, not with shouts, but with the hard set of jaws, the clack of rifles chambered, the steadying of trembling hands. Smoke curled above them, blotting the stars, while the echo of approaching walkers thundered closer through the ruined city. Calder braced himself, eyes fixed on the shadows of advancing machines. The siege had only begun, and the fight for Halcyon 9 would carve itself into every man's flesh before it ended. Pull the civilians back through the drainage tunnels now, or we lose them when the next barrage hits. Calder's shout cut through the chaos as another tremor rattled the boulevard. Windows exploded inward as the crippled walker's reactor finally gave way, sending a column of smoke spiraling into the night. Civilians stumbled across shattered pavement, clutching children, dragging carts of what little they had salvaged. The air reeked of dust and scorched concrete, stinging throats and eyes alike. Calder pressed forward, forcing order through sheer presence, his voice carrying above the din. Merrick Ivers met him at the corner, helmet cracked, uniform stained with ash. Second platoon's line is holding, but the bastards are massing armor outside District 12. If they push in together, we'll be cut in half before morning. His gravelly tone carried both exhaustion and the fury of a man unwilling to yield an inch. Calder studied him. then flicked his gaze across the chaos. His men were bleeding, yet the city itself was still standing. That was their weapon. Then we don't wait, Calder replied. We shape the ground before they step on it. This city is our fortress, and we'll turn it against them, piece by piece. He motioned for Thomas Red, the engineer, to join them. Red limped in, glasses smeared with grime, fingers raw from wrenching cables out of wreckage. He still held a broken spanner in one hand, as if he couldn't stop working even mid-report. Storm drains connect nearly every block, he said between coughs. We can run fiber through them, shielded under layers of stone. If we splice the cores I pulled from the old comm boards, we'll have a mesh they can't jam without burning half the district down. Do it, Calder said without hesitation. Every squad needs to stay connected when the nets fall. I want them sharing sight lines, ammo counts, casualty tallies, all of it. The Directorate thrives on cutting us off. We'll deny them that advantage, Vance strode in, wiping soot from his hands, a console unit strapped to his chest with wires dangling like veins. Drones are still fried from the strike, but I've got 6 maintenance kites that can hover if I bypass their safety circuits. They won't last long, but from altitude we'll get eyes on their armor columns. His voice carried a sharp edge, more defiance than hope. Rig them, Calder ordered. Paint the rooftops as if they're still running repairs. Let the enemy think civilians never left. If they're watching, we'll feed them lies until they choke on them. They set to work. Soldiers carried coils of fiber, rolling them into drains while Red directed placements with curt gestures. Sparks spat from welders as barricades rose at intersections, scavenged from ruined transports and collapsed roofs. Vance climbed a crane with 2 men, strapping kites to rusting cables, their faint rotors whining against the night air before rising into the smoke-filled sky. Each action felt makeshift, yet together it formed a pattern of preparation that Calder could sense beneath the noise. The regiment wasn't waiting for death. They were reshaping Halcyon 9 into a machine of survival. The enemy tested them soon after. The ground shivered as another walker advanced, accompanied by a skittering swarm of demolition drones. Their spotlights slashed across abandoned storefronts, beams cutting through dust like white-hot blades. Men ducked low, rifles clenched, sweat dripping despite the cool night air. Red's mines were already seated beneath the pavement, thin wires coiled beneath cracks. Calder crouched beside him, watching the enemy stride closer. Wait for it, Red muttered, his hands poised on the detonator. The drones buzzed ahead, chewing into walls with cutting torches, their sparks cascading down like molten rain. When the walker's front legs reached the center of the boulevard, Red slammed his thumb down. The pavement erupted with a shudder that lifted the earth itself, tearing the machine's limbs apart in a thunderclap. Shards of stone and steel hammered against helmets, the shock wave driving men flat. When Calder staggered upright, ears ringing, he saw the walker topple sideways, its carcass tearing open storefronts as it fell. The drones scattered wildly, some crashing into buildings, others crushed beneath the giant's ruin. Men cheered again, but Calder silenced them with a raised hand. They'll come harder. We made them cautious, not weak. Dig deeper. Every street we hold makes the next one stronger. His voice wasn't meant to inspire, only to command. Yet in the grim determination on their faces, he saw belief take root. By dawn, the regiment had reshaped the heart of the city. Fiber lines pulsed underfoot, their faint glow shielded by concrete covers. Barricades rose in layered rings, each one angled to funnel enemy advances into crossfires. Drone feeds flickered across the laser plasma display in the field post, painting the enemy's staging grounds beyond the ruined outskirts. Armor squadrons idled in neat ranks, their outlines blurred by morning haze waiting for orders. The sight made Calder's stomach tighten. Those machines outnumbered his men 10-1. Ivers leaned over the display, jaw set. When they roll in, our barricades won't stop them for long. We'll bleed, sir. We'll bleed anyway, Calder answered, eyes fixed on the glowing red markers. But we'll bleed on our terms, not theirs. He turned to Vance. Keep the feeds running. I want every movement logged, every column mapped. The second they shift formation, we'll know. Vance gave a sharp nod, fingers dancing across controls as the drones relayed images through static. One kite dipped suddenly, camera spinning before cutting out entirely. Vance swore. They're hunting them already. I'll keep the others moving between cranes, but they won't last forever. Long enough to blind the directorate, Calder replied. That's all we need. The ground command post smelled of sweat, hot wiring, and stale bread scavenged from the depot. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, uniforms streaked with soot, rifles slung, faces hollow from fatigue. Yet when Calder walked among them, offering a word, a hand on a shoulder, he saw the fire in their eyes. Not bravado, something harder, duty forged under fire. By midday, civilians had been moved into sealed blocks, the entrances rigged to collapse if breached. Families huddled in darkness, clinging to blankets, whispering prayers. Calder visited one shelter, kneeling among them, feeling the weight of their fear press against him like lead. A boy clutched a wooden toy, eyes wide as he asked, "Are the soldiers going to lose?" Calder paused, throat tightening. Then he rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not while we still stand." And we're standing, he left before the boy could ask more. Out in the streets, Ivers was barking orders, driving men to reinforce barricades. Red was buried in wires, his hands trembling with exhaustion, but refusing to stop. Vance climbed another crane, his voice echoing curses as he fought with stubborn circuits. Calder drew in the scorched air and forced himself forward. Every sense screamed fatigue, yet the fight demanded more. When dusk fell, the first coordinated assault began. Kryphos armor columns rolled forward, turrets swiveling, their thunder shaking foundations. Demolition drones swarmed low, sparks cascading as they sliced at barricades. Walkers marched in rhythm, each step booming through the streets like hammers striking anvils. From rooftops, drones fed back the sight of the city under siege, red markers converging on their grid. "Positions!" Calder roared, voice tearing through the roar of engines and the crashing barricades. Rifles rose, charges wired, eyes fixed. The directorate had underestimated the heart of Halcyon 9, and now they were walking into a city prepared to bite back. The night blazed with fire, stone, and blood, and Calder stood among his men, steel in his voice, fury in his veins, waiting to meet the storm head-on. "Get those crates moving or we'll be buried in here," Merrick Ivers bellowed as the barricade quivered under the pounding strikes of enemy drones. Sparks showered across the freight boulevard while soldiers heaved containers into position, their boots grinding against loose gravel and scorched asphalt. The first coordinated assault had begun, and the Kryphos had committed in full. From the street's edge, armor rolled forward in disciplined columns, turret fire shattering storefronts, while demolition drones crawled over wreckage like a tide of steel locusts. Calder ducked behind an overturned transport as the air vibrated with a deafening crack. Dust billowed into his throat, gritty and hot, forcing him into a fit of coughing that left his lungs burning. He spat into the rubble and forced his voice steady. "Hold your fire until they cross the markers. Make them think the road is clear." His men crouched low, fingers trembling on triggers, sweat dripping into their eyes despite the cool night wind funneling down the boulevard. From above, Vance's kites relayed footage to the laser plasma display in the makeshift command dugout. The flickering projection painted the cargo, district in shifting lines of red, showing enemy barges maneuvering for a landing. Calder glanced at the display only long enough to confirm what his ears already told him. The thunder of descending thrusters shook loose bricks from rooftops, showering the streets in shards. "They're going to cut the heart out of us," Red muttered, crouched nearby with detonator wires curled around his wrist. His hands were raw, skin split from hours of rigging charges through storm drains and conduits. "Not if your toys work," Ivers growled, pressing a fresh magazine into his rifle. His scarred face glistened with sweat, jaw clenched in grim determination. "They'll work," Red answered, though his voice cracked, betraying nerves he could not conceal. The boulevard erupted. Barges dropped into the yards, crushing parked vehicles under their bulk, ramps slamming down as Kryphos troopers spilled out in disciplined ranks. The air shook with the hiss of their weapons, bolts ripping across barricades and tearing plaster from walls. Soldiers cried out, some collapsing in sprays of blood, others dragging comrades behind shattered concrete barriers. Calder's gut twisted, but he shouted through the storm, "Wait for the signal! Keep their confidence high. Make them walk deeper." The Cryphos advanced with machine efficiency, their helmets glinting under floodlights, armored boots crushing debris. They swept forward, drones cutting wires and chewing barricades apart with grinding saws. Civilians hidden in tunnels below could hear the vibrations through the earth, their muffled sobs rising faintly beneath the roar above. Then Calder raised his fist. "Now!" Red slammed his palm on the trigger. The street convulsed as buried charges tore upward, ripping a jagged trench across the boulevard. Fire and debris engulfed the leading ranks of Cryphos troops, hurling bodies like rag dolls into the sides of buildings. Screams mingled with the screech of twisting steel. Calder surged up from cover, rifle barking as he cut down dazed survivors scrambling to regain formation. His men joined him, unleashing a torrent of fire that filled the boulevard with flashes of muzzle light and the pungent tang of burnt propellant. But the enemy did not scatter. They adjusted instantly, troopers falling into cover positions while walkers behind them opened fire. Barricades splintered as heavy rounds slammed into them, flinging fragments into men's faces. A soldier beside Calder crumpled with a cry, half his leg torn away, his blood seeping across the cracked pavement. Ivers dragged him backward with one arm while firing with the other, his curses rising above the din. Overhead, Vance's kite swooped lower, guiding mortar fire from hidden rooftops. Explosions flared among the advancing ranks, but still they pressed on, methodical, unshaken. Calder's teeth clenched as he fired again and again, feeling the recoil pound into his shoulder until it throbbed. Suddenly, a demolition drone skittered over the barricade, sparks spitting from its cutting arms. Calder lunged forward, boots smashing into its frame, sending it spinning. He jammed the muzzle of his rifle into its chassis and squeezed the trigger until it erupted in a shower of sparks, fragments stinging his cheek. The acrid taste of metal dust coated his tongue as he spat again, eyes watering. "They're breaking left," Vance called through comms, his voice ragged. "Barge unloading near the crane yard, dozens pouring out." Calder grabbed Ivers' shoulder. "Take your squad and cut them off before they flank us. If they seize that yard, we lose every fallback line." Ivers nodded once, face grim, before rallying his men with a roar. They vaulted barricades, boots pounding across gravel, disappearing into smoke as the clash shifted toward the crane yard. Red scrambled beside Calder, pulling a fresh detonator from his belt. "I've got one more surprise wired into the stacks," he said, sweat streaming down his temples. "If they push into the yard, I'll bring it down on top of them." "Hold until you see their banners," Calder snapped. "If we collapse it too early, it's wasted." "Make it count." The battle raged into the yards where towering stacks of containers loomed like walls. The Cryphos surged between them, weapons flashing in bursts of light. Human soldiers darted in and out of the maze, ambushing from above with grenades, then vanishing before return fire could track them. Every sound was amplified in the enclosed spaces, the rattle of automatic fire, the thunder of collapsing steel, the desperate cries of the wounded echoing in hollow corridors. Calder led a squad through one narrow lane, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. His lungs screamed as he pushed forward, eyes watering, ears ringing from the concussions around him. They burst into a clearing where a walker loomed, its cannons swiveling toward them. For one frozen heartbeat, Calder felt death approach. Then Red's charges ignited. A tower of containers crashed down onto the walker, crushing it under a cascade of steel. The ground shuddered, a shock wave ripping through the men's boots. Shards of metal speared into walls, rattling through the night like thunder. Soldiers staggered, some thrown off their feet, but the walker was buried, its legs twitching helplessly beneath the wreckage. Calder's men cheered, but their voices faltered when the smoke cleared to reveal another column advancing behind. Exhaustion lined every face, uniforms torn, arms streaked with grime and blood. Yet not one man stepped back. Calder raised his rifle high, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They want this yard? Make them pay for every crate, every inch of it." The regiment roared as one, surging forward to meet the Cryphos with bayonets flashing and grenades exploding at their feet. Steel met steel, flesh met fire, and the yards became a slaughterhouse. Under a sky lit by burning cranes. By the time the assault ebbed, bodies lay scattered across the wreckage, human and alien alike. The yards were soaked with sweat and blood, every surface slick beneath trembling boots. Calder stood amid it, chest heaving, weapon empty, ears ringing in the silence that followed. His men leaned against walls, some weeping openly, others staring blankly into the smoke-stained air. Ivers returned limping, one arm slung over a soldier's shoulder, face streaked with ash. "We held it," he rasped. "Cost us half a company, but the yard is still ours." Calder swallowed the bitterness, clawing his throat. He forced his voice firm, though grief tugged at every word. "Then we count the fallen, mark their names, and keep building. This fight isn't done. We'll carve this city into their grave if we must." The men looked to him, their faces hollow yet unbroken. And in their silence, Calder knew the truth. The freight yards had become more than a battleground. They were a promise that Halcyon 9 would not fall quietly, not while any man still breathed. "Drag that drone inside before its beacon draws more fire." Calder barked as two exhausted corporals wrestled the wreckage of a downed Cryphos courier machine through the doorway of the battered depot. The shell still hissed with escaping vapor, its wings snapped and sparking. Every scrape against the floor made the soldiers flinch, as though the thing might explode in their arms. They dumped it onto a scorched table beneath a cracked light panel, sweat pouring from their faces. Calder motioned for Thomas Red, already limping from shrapnel, to bring his tools. The room reeked of scorched rubber and sweat-soaked uniforms. Men huddled along the walls, coughing through dust, their rifles leaning against their knees. The city outside groaned with distant detonations, each one rolling through the floor and rattling teeth. Calder leaned against the table, eyes fixed on the strange carcass. "Whatever's inside it kept transmitting even after its hull cracked," he said, voice sharp. "That means orders, maybe vulnerabilities. If we can read their doctrine, we can bleed them twice as hard." Red wiped grime from his lenses and pulled a dented kit from his pack. "If the cores aren't fried, I'll dig something out," he muttered, already slicing into the casing. Sparks flared, the acrid tang of burned circuitry stinging noses. He hissed as hot shards bit into his fingertips, but his hands never slowed. Vance crouched beside him, fidgeting with a salvaged heads-up display unit linked by wires to the drone's core. "If he pulls anything, I'll mirror it here," he said, his voice low, a mixture of dread and curiosity. Minutes dragged. Men listened to their own shallow breathing, to the tap of Red's tools, to muffled screams echoing faintly from streets beyond. Then the heads-up display flickered to life, lines of alien text running across its surface. Vance's fingers flew across keys, his brow furrowing. "It's a logistics packet. Movement orders, reinforcement schedules, local doctrine updates." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Here, Directive Gray Line." Calder stepped closer. "Translate it." Vance's voice dropped, heavy with disbelief. "It says human interiors, sealed structures, basements, bunkers, carry oxygen concentrations toxic to their physiology. They're forbidden from extended exposure without heavy suits. That's why they're leaning on standoff weapons. They can't match us at close range inside sealed zones." The silence in the room deepened until the only sound was the distant pounding of artillery. Men exchanged stunned looks, eyes wide. Ivers spat on the floor, shaking his head. "They've been fighting us from a distance not because they respect us, but because they're terrified of our air." His gravelly voice carried both derision and grim satisfaction. Red let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his split knuckles. "All this time we thought they were untouchable machines. Turns out they choke in our basements." Calder kept his gaze on the glowing display. His pulse hammered, not with triumph, but with the cold weight of responsibility. "Then we shift the battlefield. We don't wait for them to breach our barricades. We pull them into our sealed blocks. We trap them where their doctrine forbids them to go." He straightened, voice sharpening as men leaned in. "But we don't let them know we've discovered this. If they realize, they'll torch the whole city from orbit. Instead, we feed them what they expect. Rumors of special forces strikes. Raids on their orbitals. Make them guard the skies while our regulars tear them apart on the ground. The plan spread through the regiment like fire through dry brush. Within the hour, Calder had his officers gathered around the laser plasma display, the city grid glowing with red and blue overlays. He traced routes with a gloved finger, sweat dripping down his temple. Evacuate District 6 and 8. Seal them. Leave power signatures active to make them appear occupied. When Cryphos scans, they'll see movement where there is none. Meanwhile, we'll rewire tunnels and rig pressure doors with fallback explosives. Those ghost districts become traps. Ivers leaned across the table, his scarred hand tapping at the map. And the civilians? They'll panic if we start uprooting them again. We tell them the truth, Calder answered, that those blocks can't be held, but they can be used. Their suffering buys us time. Without that, we lose everyone. His words cut like stone, and silence followed, yet no one argued. Red scribbled notes furiously, muttering under his breath about conduits and tunnel seals. Vance uploaded false transmissions to the drone network, scattering whispers of special forces raiding orbital nodes. Soldiers carried fiber reels on their shoulders, running them through storm drains while water dripped cold and foul down their necks. Sweat-burned eyes, hands blistered on steel, yet they pushed without complaint. The memory of directive gray lines spurred them harder than any speech. By evening, the first decoy district was ready. Families had been marched out with carts and crying children, escorted by weary riflemen. Once the last had crossed the barricade, Ivers ordered the pressure doors welded shut. The clang echoed down the street like a coffin lid closing. Inside, empty apartments glowed faintly as Red's team wired false power draws into the grid. From above, they looked alive. Calder stood in the street as the final weld cooled, the torchlight painting his face in hard relief. A young soldier approached, helmet tucked under his arm, voice hesitant. "Captain, what happens if the aliens actually enter one of these ghost blocks?" Calder looked at him, eyes bloodshot from smoke and sleeplessness. "Then we show them what their doctrine never prepared them for." He didn't explain further. The boy swallowed, nodded, and walked back to his post, jaw tight. The first test came before dawn. Cryphos drones swept low, cameras whirring as they scanned the sealed districts, their data relayed back to their command. Soon after, walkers diverted from the main assault and began to converge on District 6. From the command post, Calder watched the feeds flicker across the heads-up display, the enemy moving exactly where he had wanted. His throat tightened, not with fear but with anticipation. "They're taking the bait," Vance whispered, almost in disbelief. Calder's reply was flat, iron hard. "Then we bury them there." The soldiers manning the barricades tightened their grips, waiting in the dim light. The city groaned around them, scarred yet unbroken. The war had shifted. For the first time since the siege began, Calder felt the ground tilt, not in favor of the Cryphos, but toward the men who bled in its streets. "Seal that hatch now, or they'll walk right through us," Merrick Ivers thundered, his fist clenched around the handle of a welding torch. Sparks showered in bursts as steel plates fused over the storm drain, the acrid bite of burning insulation filling every breath. Soldiers stood ankle-deep in dust and shattered plaster, muscles straining as they shifted barricades into place. Beyond the barricade, the groan of Cryphos walkers echoed through the ruined streets, their massive steps cracking asphalt and sending tremors through the ground like distant drums. Captain Nash Calder stood in the shadow of a half-collapsed tower, eyes fixed on the sealed district ahead. Families had been herded out only hours before, clutching satchels and bundles, tears streaking their faces as they fled into the night. Now the same homes glowed faintly from rigged circuits, power readings convincing to any scan. The enemy believed those blocks still held life. In reality, the district was nothing but hollow streets wired with mines, hidden firing lanes, and traps waiting to be sprung. "Captain!" Red called out, his hands blackened from hours of dragging wires through debris. He pointed at the heads-up display strapped to his arm, the screen showing blurred icons moving toward the sealed area. "Their formation is tight, walkers in front, infantry trailing, drones sweeping side alleys. They're swallowing the bait." Calder's jaw tightened. "Then we're ready. Hold until they're in the grid, then trigger the collapse. No mistakes. We can't afford waste. His voice was flat, but his chest hammered with the weight of knowing dozens of his men might not survive the hour. The air thickened as the Cryphos column entered District 6. Dust sifted down from rooftops with each impact of their machines. Through gaps in barricades, soldiers glimpsed the alien troops, tall figures in segmented armor, visors gleaming in the dark. Their weapons spat bursts that cracked against empty walls, searching for phantoms. Drones darted down alleys, their beams slicing through hanging laundry and abandoned carts. The city seemed to hold its breath. Then a child's sob carried from the tunnel below, faint but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Calder's stomach dropped. He spun toward Ivers. "I thought civilians were clear." "They were," Ivers snapped, eyes blazing. "That family must have doubled back when the shelling started." His hand trembled against his rifle. "If they're caught, they won't be." Calder's voice cut through his fear, though his own hands shook. He seized his helmet, yanking the strap tight. "I'll pull them out." Hold the line before Ivers could protest. Calder vaulted the barricade and sprinted into the ghost block. The air was thick with grit, every breath raw against his throat. Shadows stretched long across the street as the Cryphos patrol advanced, their footfalls shaking his bones. Calder darted between shattered walls, ducking behind a collapsed balcony. He could taste blood in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue, hear the hiss of servos as a walker strode closer. "Captain, where the hell are you going?" Vance's voice cracked over comms, panic woven into every word. "Locating civilians," Calder whispered back, his throat dry. "Trigger nothing until I give the word." He found them in a basement stairwell, a man clutching his wife, both shielding a boy who whimpered against his chest. Their eyes widened when Calder burst in, rifle slung across his back. "Move!" he hissed. "Now!" He dragged the boy into his arms, ignoring the sting in his shoulders, and waved the parents up the steps. The street above shook with another blast, dust raining across their faces. They broke into the open, sprinting across rubble toward the barricade. A Cryphos drone swiveled midair, its beam slicing across the family. Calder dropped, rolling as fire cracked, inches from his head. He raised his rifle and fired, rounds tearing into the drone until it spiraled down in flames. The family screamed, stumbling, but he shoved them forward. "Cover them!" Ivers roared from behind the barricade. Rifles erupted, streaks of tracer fire cutting through the night as soldiers carved a path. Calder shoved the boy into waiting arms as the parents collapsed inside the barricade, sobbing. Then he turned back toward the district, chest heaving, voice hoarse. "Now, Red, do it!" The street convulsed. Mines erupted under the advancing walkers, blasting legs into jagged fragments. Towers of dust and flame roared skyward, rattling bones and scalding skin. Entire walls collapsed, burying alien infantry beneath tons of debris. Soldiers roared with fury as they opened fire, bullets and grenades saturating the kill zone. Calder felt the heat slam against his face, smelled the stench of scorched fabric and fuel, tasted grit grinding between his teeth. The Cryphos fought back, even crippled. Drones swarmed, some carving into barricades, others detonating themselves against makeshift shields. One walker, missing a leg, dragged itself forward on its remaining limbs, its cannon spitting death until a rocket seared into its core, ripping it apart in a burst that lit the district like dawn. Calder slammed fresh rounds into his rifle, firing until his arms burned. Around him, men screamed orders, curses, prayers, their voices blending into one ragged chorus. Blood slicked the ground, bodies lay scattered across rubble, but the enemy was trapped in their own arrogance, forced into terrain they had sworn to avoid. Minutes stretched into eternity. At last the firing slowed, the smoke thickening into a choking haze. Through the swirling ash, Calder saw alien forms staggering backward, their line broken, retreating into shadows. The district they had tried to seize now smoldered, nothing left but shattered armor and twisted wreckage. Red collapsed against a wall, his face streaked with soot and tears. "It worked," he whispered, almost in disbelief. His blistered hands shook as he stared at the ruin he had unleashed. Ivers limped forward, helmet dented, eyes bloodshot. He looked at Calder, voice raw. You saved that family when you could have saved yourself. Why? Calder wiped blood from his lip, chest heaving. Because if we forget who we're fighting for, then the city isn't worth saving. Silence followed, heavier than the smoke. Men looked at him, not cheering, not shouting, but carrying something harder in their eyes. Recognition. The fight wasn't just survival now. It was personal. As dawn bled across the shattered skyline, the regiment stood battered but unbroken, watching the ghost district burn. The enemy had been taught what it meant to trespass in streets shaped by human hands. And Calder knew this was only the first lesson. Move the guns before they lock coordinates. Calder's voice tore across the barricade as the dawn haze split with enemy fire. Mortar rounds slammed into the crane yard, the earth jolting under each strike, containers toppling like dominoes. Soldiers scattered, dragging wounded comrades across broken pavement, slick with oil and blood. The air clanged with the grinding of steel beams falling, every crash reverberating in the chest like a hammer blow. Merrick Ivers staggered through the chaos, dragging a soldier missing half an arm. His own helmet was dented, visor cracked, one eye swollen shut. He dropped the man behind cover and snarled at Calder. They're throwing their whole weight at this sector. If we don't close the yard, we're finished. Calder's lungs burned from smoke and grit. His rifle was hot in his hands, the stock slick with sweat. He forced his gaze through the cloud of dust and saw the truth. 3 barges dropping in staggered sequence. Walker escorts leaping from ramps as their weapons lit up the ground. Cryphos infantry poured forward in disciplined wedges, their armor glinting under the fires rising from collapsed fuel tanks. The trap districts had worked, but now the directorate meant to break the city by sheer numbers. He slammed his comm bead. Red! Pull every mag line splice into motion. Collapse the containers west of the quay. Static snapped, then Red's strained voice answered. Already wired. It'll seal them in, but I can't guarantee the lines will hold after a second collapse. Doesn't matter, Calder growled. Do it on my mark. Gunfire roared from rooftops. Vance's drones darted between cranes, trailing thin smoke from damaged rotors. Their feeds flickered across the laser plasma display in the command alcove, showing angles the men below could never see. They've brought counter swarms, Vance shouted, sweat streaming down his temple. Dozens of them. Our drones won't last 2 minutes. Then make them count for 1, Calder shot back. Guide the mortars before they're shredded. Explosions rattled the yard, raining sparks and twisted metal. Calder sprinted through, his boots slipping on loose gravel, ears ringing. He grabbed a fallen man by the straps and heaved him behind cover, muscles screaming. Bullets pinged against the wreckage beside him, shards stinging his cheek. He ignored the warmth of blood trailing down his skin and shouted to the nearest squad. Shift fire left. Cut that column before they breach the line. Ivers appeared beside him, rifle braced against his shoulder, firing controlled bursts that tore into the advancing Cryphos. His voice was raw. We can't hold this with rifles alone. That's why we built the trap, Calder snapped. He lifted his arm, signaling to Red. Now! The earth shuddered as mag lines groaned to life, dragging container stacks sideways in grinding arcs. The screech of metal against metal was deafening, drowning every other sound for a heartbeat. Then the towers collapsed, toppling across the boulevard in a roaring avalanche. Dust erupted, swallowing whole squads of Cryphos infantry. A walker screamed in distorted mechanical tones as a wall of steel crushed it flat. Men on the barricade cheered, their relief sharp and desperate. But the victory was fleeting. The second barge disgorged fresh troops behind the collapse, their weapons spitting into the smoke. Counter swarms surged into the air, slicing drones apart mid-flight. Vance cursed, his console sparking as he forced a final guidance lock. Mortars fell in a staggered arc, detonating above the swarm in fiery bursts, ripping dozens apart. The rest scattered, filling the air with shrill keening. Red stumbled into view, his face gray from exhaustion, his shirt soaked through. Lines are burned out, he rasped. That was the last collapse we can manage. From here, it's rifles and courage. Calder clapped a hand on his shoulder, firm despite the weight pressing on his chest. You bought us breathing room? That's all we ever needed. The fight devolved into brutal chaos. Kryphos infantry charged through smoke, their segmented armor gleaming, their war cries guttural and harsh. Human soldiers met them in alleys, grenades tossed at close range, bayonets flashing in desperate arcs. The air reeked of burnt fuel, coppery blood, and plaster dust. Calder fired until his rifle clicked empty, then slammed in a fresh magazine with trembling hands. His shoulder throbbed from recoil, ears buzzing with each concussion. A cry tore from the left flank. Calder turned to see a squad cornered by a walker, its cannon swiveling toward them. He sprinted, lungs tearing, boots pounding. He vaulted wreckage, rolled behind cover, and raised his launcher. His breath steadied in the chaos. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket streaked and slammed into the walker's knee joint. The machine buckled, groaning as it toppled sideways into a crane column. Steel shrieked as the column collapsed, crushing both machine and soldiers beneath it. The shock wave knocked Calder flat, rubble biting into his ribs. He pushed up, coughing blood into his sleeve, and forced himself onward. Ivers knelt over another soldier, pressing a bandage against a gaping wound. His face was ash pale, but his eyes burned. "We're losing too many," he growled, voice breaking. "Half the companies are gone." Calder knelt, pressing his hand over Ivers to steady the bandage. "Every minute we stand here is a victory. We're not measured by ground. We're measured by time. Hold, Merrick." The man met his gaze, lips trembling, then nodded with clenched jaw. He shoved the bandage tighter and screamed at the wounded soldier. "You'll see tomorrow, you stubborn bastard." "You will." The ground shook again, this time not from walkers, but from the detonation of the third barge as hidden charges finally found its fuel lines. A tower of fire ripped the night apart, raining shards of hull across the yard. Men dove for cover, some too slow, their cries swallowed in the roar. Calder shielded his face, heat scorching his skin even through armor. When he rose, his eyes burned from smoke, his ears throbbed, and his heart pounded with both triumph and grief. Vance's last drone feed flickered and died, the console dark. He ripped the headset off, face twisted in rage. "That's it." "We're blind," Calder forced air into his lungs, chest heaving. "Then we fight by sound, by instinct, by grit. This city is ours, and we'll remind them of that with every step they take." As the flames raged higher, the regiment clung to its barricades, battered yet still standing. The spiral trap had sprung. The enemy was bleeding in the streets they thought empty, while human soldiers clawed survival from smoke and fire. Calder raised his weapon again, voice hoarse but steady. "Hold the yard. Every heartbeat buys the fleet another breath," men answered with fire, with grit in their eyes, with voices hoarse from screaming. The night carried on, filled with thunder, steel, and the unyielding defiance of men who refused to break. "Get down! Incoming from orbit!" Vance screamed as the sky tore open in streaks of fire. Calder threw himself behind a shattered wall as fragments rained down, clanging across stone and steel. The blast wave thundered through the yard, tossing men against barricades, ripping scaffolds into shrapnel. The third barge's detonation had enraged the Kryphos command, and now their retaliation descended with unrelenting fury. Calder's ears rang as he staggered upright, grit crunching between his teeth. Flames clawed the night, shadows flickering across wreckage and bodies alike. Ivers limped into view, dragging a soldier whose chest barely rose, his voice raw with fury. "They're torching their own footholds just to bury us with them." His words cracked as another explosion split the horizon, sending a rain of glass across the boulevard. Calder seized him by the arm, steadying his balance. "Not torching, Merrick. They're clearing sky lanes for something bigger." His gaze shifted upward, where glowing pylons hung in orbit like skeletal towers. The Kryphos were detonating their own stasis nodes, breaking the blockade grid so reinforcements could descend unhindered. "If they get heavy armor through, we're finished." Vance scrambled over rubble, clutching his shattered console. "The artillery section still has fire control," he panted, sweat streaking through soot. "But their coordinates are blind without drone eyes." "Then we give them targets by hand," Calder snapped. "Signal the section to load every remaining round. We time the shots on my mark." He turned toward the survivors huddled nearby, their faces hollow but watchful. Every man here has one task: buy the fleet time. Nothing else matters. The order spread like wildfire. Men dragged artillery shells across cracked pavement, their boots slipping on blood and oil. Hands bled as they loaded barrels, jaws clenched tight against exhaustion. The air vibrated with the deep growl of cannons spooling, their barrels glowing faintly as they locked into firing cradles. Ivers pressed a fresh magazine into his rifle and leaned close to Calder. "You're gambling every last shot on timing." Calder met his bloodshot eye. "We don't get another chance." The next orbital strike descended, searing through the skyline. Calder raised his hand, waiting as his heartbeat thundered against his ribs. The heat licked across his face, his vision blurred with smoke, but he held steady until the moment arrived. "Fire!" The earth bucked as the artillery section unleashed. Shells screamed skyward, streaking through the fading contrails of the enemy's bombardment. Men squinted upward, breath held. Then the first detonation split the night. A pylon erupted in a blossom of light, fragments scattering into burning arcs. Cheers rose, raw and desperate, as the second and third shots tore apart the remaining towers. The blockade grid collapsed, its skeletal frame falling like dying stars. Vance's console lit with signals. "That's it! They've lost orbital control in this sector." His voice cracked, half disbelief, half triumph. Calder's throat was sandpaper, but he forced words out. "Then signal Echo 9. Tell the convoy it's time miles beyond the horizon." Ships that had been idling for days came alive. Tugs laden with derelict hulls and scraps surged into motion, their trajectories long rehearsed. Echo 9's voice came through the channel, ragged yet steady. "Convoy moving. We'll ram them off your sky if we have to." On the ground, the Cryphos pressed harder, their infantry surging with renewed fury. Barricades cracked. Men screamed as drones poured into alleys. Red staggered into cover, blood dripping from his ear, his hands blackened from failed charges. "Captain, they're throwing everything at us. They know if we hold now, they lose the sky." "Then we hold," Calder roared back, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. He fired until his shoulder ached, each burst cutting down armored figures that clawed toward their lines. Around him, men bled, cursed, and fought with a ferocity born of knowing there was no retreat. Above, the convoy arrived. From the shattered skyline, trails of fire cut downward as tugs hurled their loads into Cryphos picket ships. Scrap collided with shields in thunderous impacts, vessels tearing apart in flaming spirals. The night glowed red as wreckage cascaded across the horizon, turning the sky into a graveyard of twisted hulks. Echo 9's transmission came through again, static-filled but fierce. "We've broken their perimeter. Your air lanes are clear. Hold ground. We'll drag in the supply ships before dawn." Calder closed his eyes for one fleeting second, relief piercing the fog of battle. Then he forced himself back to the present. "You heard them," he shouted, voice raw. "One night more. That's all we need." The regiment clung to its ruined barricades as the Cryphos pushed with a savagery that made the earth itself quake. Every sense was overwhelmed, the bitter taste of smoke coating tongues, the sting of grit in eyes, the deafening thunder of collapsing walls, the heat-searing skin. Yet the line held, not by strength of numbers, but by refusal to break. Calder crouched beside Ivers as the sergeant major fired round after round, his arms trembling from fatigue. "They'll come again at dawn," Ivers muttered through cracked lips. Calder's reply was steady, though his chest ached. "Then we'll still be here to meet them." The flames of the fallen pylons still burned in the heavens, lighting the ruined city in crimson glow. The sky itself seemed to bear witness as Halcyon 9 refused to die. "Captain, they're massing again." Vance's voice cracked through the comms as another shockwave rattled the barricade. Calder pulled himself upright against a scorched slab of concrete, lungs burning with the dust-laden air. Across the yard, fires licked upward from shattered cranes, throwing jagged shadows over exhausted men crouched behind cover. The Cryphos had regrouped despite the orbital collapse, their command unwilling to concede. Armor shapes loomed in the drifting smoke, and the clatter of alien weapons rolled closer with every heartbeat. Calder forced his body forward, every muscle aching, his uniform stiff with dried blood. Ivers appeared at his side, eyes hollow but still burning. We can't repel another charge. Half our companies are gone, medics are down to strips of cloth, and ammunition is running dry. He spat grit from his mouth and glared at the smoke ahead. If they push once more, we'll break. Calder rested a hand on the older man's shoulder, his grip steady despite the tremor in his own arm. We hold because if we fall, the convoys die before they ever touch ground. 1 more hour, Merrick. That's all we need. He raised his rifle, his voice cutting across the men scattered through the rubble. Dig in. They think regulars will fold. Show them what they stepped into. The Cryphos advanced with the mechanical rhythm of their doctrine. Walkers stomping into range, infantry fanning into alleys. Explosives detonated beneath their feet. Charges ripping steel plates into the air, tearing ranks apart. Men roared with fury, rifles spitting flame, grenades arching into choke points. Calder's ears rang with the thunder, the smell of burning fuel and blood churning his stomach, the sting of powder smoke cutting into his eyes. He fired until his shoulder throbbed, his vision narrowed to the sights of his weapon. Around him, soldiers fell and others surged forward to take their place, the line bending but not collapsing. Red stumbled into view, his hands raw and bleeding from hours of rewiring circuits. He, Terrifies, dragged a length of cable over his shoulder, teeth clenched. Captain, last set of detonators is armed under the key. When their armor crosses it, I can drop the whole platform. His voice cracked with exhaustion, yet conviction kept him standing. Calder met his gaze, searching the man's face. Will it hold our men too? Red hesitated, swallowing hard. If they're too close, yes. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the screams of battle. Calder looked past him, watching the Cryphos line creep nearer, step by step. Do it anyway, he said at last. We're out of time. Better a graveyard they can't claim than a city handed over. Red gave a tight nod, wiping his face with the back of a shaking hand before crawling back into the smoke. Ivers growled, You just gave the order to bury our own. I gave the order to finish this, Calder replied, voice low but unflinching. The Cryphos armor thundered onto the quay, their walkers striding across a cracked pavement, weapons swiveling for the kill. Alien infantry moved behind them, their guttural shouts echoing between gutted warehouses. Calder's heartbeat slowed as he saw the moment align. He pressed his comm bead. Red. Now the ground convulsed in a detonation that split the city. The quay collapsed inward, a yawning pit swallowing armor, walkers, and infantry alike. Screams, mechanical shrieks, and the roar of shattering steel filled the air as the Cryphos line vanished beneath a rolling wave of fire and stone. The shock wave knocked men from their feet, rubble pelting their armor, heat searing their skin. Calder slammed against the barricade, his ears ringing, his breath torn from his lungs. When the smoke cleared, silence stretched across the battlefield. Where the Cryphos had stood, there was only a gaping ruin filled with twisted wreckage. Survivors among the aliens staggered back, their lines broken, their will to press further shattered. Through the haze, Calder saw their banners fall and their formation dissolve into retreat. The ground trembled as their remaining walkers lumbered away, limping toward extraction. Ivers hauled himself upright, coughing blood into his hand. They're leaving, he rasped, disbelief etched across his battered face. By God, they're leaving. Cheers rose weakly from the men, some sobbing outright, others pounding their rifles against rubble. Calder stood among them, his chest heavy with both triumph and grief. He looked around at the faces, grimy, bloodied, some staring blankly at the bodies of friends beside them. The cost of holding Halcyon 9 was carved into every expression. Vance limped over, clutching a broken headset, his face smeared with ash. Convoy is through. Supply ships are landing. We bought them the lanes, Captain. His voice wavered, thick with exhaustion. We did it. Calder exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment before answering. We didn't do it for ships. We did it for the names that won't be here when the sun rises. He glanced toward the makeshift rollboard, where fallen soldiers' names had been scrawled in charcoal, already too many to count. As dawn lit the battered city, supply cranes creaked back to life, their silhouettes rising above rubble like skeletal guardians. Civilians emerged from shelters, blinking at the light, their faces a mixture of grief and awe. The regiment stood ragged, weapons lowered, eyes fixed on the horizon where the Cryphos ships dwindled. Ivers stepped beside Calder, his voice low. They'll write this one into their doctrine. Regular infantry tearing apart a directorate assault. They'll fear the word line regiment from now on. Calder's gaze lingered on the smoke curling from the ruins, the taste of grit still coating his tongue. Let them, he said. If they tremble at the thought of our regulars, imagine what they'll believe about the forces we haven't shown them yet. The words carried across the broken yard, reaching soldiers too weary to cheer, but strong enough to straighten their backs. It was not a boast but a warning, and every man there understood it. By evening, the fleet had docked and supplies poured into the city. Wounded were carried out, dead laid in rows beneath tarps, their silence the truest testament of what had been bought. Calder knelt by the rollboard, charcoal in hand, writing names with slow care. Each letter felt like a nail driven into his chest. When he finished, he pressed the charcoal into Ivers's hand. Keep adding. Throughput is their legacy. The Cryphos withdrawal rippled far beyond Halcyon 9. Reports carried across the stars, whispers spreading in war councils and trade routes alike. Humans had held with regular infantry against a directorate siege. Their myth of special forces grew sharper, but behind it came a deeper truth, that even ordinary regiments could turn cities into traps and battlefields into graves. As night fell, Calder stood on the quay's edge, the ruins still smoking below. He felt the weight of his men's eyes on him, the ghosts of the fallen pressing close. He spoke quietly, but his words carried. We are the regulars, and we are enough. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning, stronger than any shout. The regiment had survived, the colony had endured, and the galaxy itself had been forced to remeasure what humanity meant in war. If this story sent shivers down your spine, smash that subscribe button for more cinematic HFY battles that prove humanity's edge isn't just firepower, it's how we fight. Now we want to hear from you. If you commanded a human regiment facing a galactic siege, what unconventional tactic would you use to make the enemy regret ever landing on Earth's soil? Share your strategy in the comments. We rate every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where ordinary soldiers make extraordinary history. See you in the next story.